We the people.
We the people.
We the people of the United States.
We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
In the summer of 1787, 55 men gathered in Philadelphia to consider how to make the government of the United States more perfect. Over the course of 5 months, they argued, debated, considered and rejected ideas, notions, and various systems. In the end, they created the Constitution of the United States, a document predicated on the idea that men can rule themselves by law. This is Constitution Thursday, a time when we look at the history, ideas, arguments, and interpretations of the Constitution, from its original creation to today, and how it affects our lives now.
Well, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you are, whatever you do. It's Constitution Thursday, no matter where you are. That's what we do here on the Dave Bowman Show. We got a lot to talk about today. We've got a lot to continue in our thoughts and processes, but if you'd like to join me or comment or complain, there's the number, 209-565-DAVE. That's voicemails and texts. Email Dave at thedavebowmanshow.com. And of course, we're on the web. Just look for the Dave Bowman Show on Facebook, Twitter, iTunes, and Anchor. Ego Biberi Capulas at Olive Viver. I drink coffee, so there's my live. I'm not drinking coffee today. There's some reasons for it that I may or may not have time to get into, but they're completely personal, so they don't really matter all that much to this. We're talking about the year 1876. 1876 is a watershed year. And the reason it's a watershed year is because I believe that many of the issues that we are facing today as a nation can be traced to the results of the 1876 election. It's going to take some time to tell you why I believe that, but we're going to go through this. And in some ways, last week's show about Hamburg, South Carolina, was sort of just an introduction to that, and it might make more sense after this show. And when I put this whole thing together, finally, last week's show might come second after this week's show, because I just I think it makes more sense after this one, at least it does in my mind. Primarily, we're talking constitutionally about 3 amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which are collectively known as the Reconstruction Amendments. These amendments were all passed in the wake of the combat portion of the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. Most of us are very familiar with the 13th Amendment, which bans slavery in the United States. It took a constitutional amendment to do that, ratified in December of 1865, because the Emancipation Proclamation, which so many have pointed out is an executive order, could have been overturned if it remained an executive order. By making a constitutional amendment that eliminated the possibility of it being overturned and put the ban on slavery in place permanently. Likewise, the 14th Amendment also passed-ish in 1866, and we've spent some time talking about that in the past, made sure that everyone understood that citizenship was a birthright in our country, and it did not depend on any previous condition of servitude. In other words, previous slaves are now citizens of the United States, and therefore they are due the equal protection of our laws. That was ratified-ish in 1866. And the 14th Amendment was a real sticking point. There were a lot of states that did not like the 14th Amendment. I will tell you that California, liberal today California, did not pass the 14th Amendment, did not vote to approve the 14th Amendment until 1950. So that should tell you that there's some things there that the states did not like in the 14th Amendment. More importantly, all the former Confederate states had to ratify both the 13th and 14th amendments before they would be readmitted as full-fledged states in the Union. Prior to their admission of doing so, they would not be readmitted. They would be maintained in a position of Reconstruction, that is a military governorship, a military occupation by Union troops, or American troops more precisely. Many of those troops, by the way, as we saw last week in Hamburg, many of those troops were African Americans. And that was creating some friction, as we saw. Later, in 1870, the 15th Amendment would be passed. This would grant voting rights. That part of the problems that they were facing were concerns that the states that went ahead and ratified the 14th Amendment, and not just southern states, by the way, were going ahead and, well, they were passing laws that limited the vote, that restricted the vote. They were passing poll taxes. They were passing land ownership rules. They were making it so that freedmen, former slaves, literally could not vote, primarily because in some cases the laws were specific about you can't vote if you're black. Well, Congress had some problems with that, and they put together the 15th Amendment, which was ratified in 1870. Now, the interesting thing about these three amendments, and specifically the 15th Amendment and the 14th Amendments, Congress got some blowback for this, and they were deeply concerned that the Supreme Court was going to take up cases arising under the 14th and 15th Amendments early on, and so particularly the 14th Amendment. And it looked like there was a lot of constitutional scholarship in those days, which is a term I hate. I know I've said that before, but that being the case, there was a lot of concern that the Supreme Court would find laws passed under the 14th Amendment or state laws regarding these things, that the court would essentially strike down any of the laws, that they were unconstitutional, specifically the Reconstruction Acts. Congress, under the 14th Amendment and 13th Amendment, passed 4 laws that required the southern states to pass these things to be readmitted. And they were very concerned that the Supreme Court was going to become activist and was going to strike down these laws, saying they were unconstitutional, and so that these southern states could go ahead and rejoin, even though they hadn't ratified 13th and 14th Amendments. So Congress, we talked some weeks ago about some of the things Congress can do in reaction to Supreme Court rulings. In this particular case, in the face of a potential Supreme Court ruling, the United States Congress passed they passed laws that essentially changed the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court so that they would have no jurisdiction under the Reconstruction Acts. And so any opportunity to appeal to the Supreme Court that these acts were unconstitutional went right out the window. And you got to admit, it's a pretty clever way of doing things if you're doing that. I need to give you some definitions before we dive into what we're going to get into this week. Some definitions, particularly on one side, the Bourbon Democrats. Now, let me say this up front. What we're going to talk about a lot over the next few episodes, we're looking at a couple of things. Number one, we're looking at the myth of the lost cause myth. This idea that somehow the South was right. We've talked about it briefly before. We're kind of looking at the genesis of that, which I believe is part of the problem that we're facing today. We're looking at a secondary idea that is widely accepted, that the two parties, the Democrats of the 1860s and the Republicans of the 1860s, have switched places, and that now the Democrats of the 1860s are the Republicans of the 1860s. The Democrats today are the Republicans of the 1860s, and vice versa. And you can talk to a lot of people about that. You can say, well, why do you believe that? And very few people can articulate why they believe it. They'll tell you some party line stuff about, they don't care about this, or we care about that, or we care about this and they don't care about that. But very few people can really articulate why they believe this switch occurred. And almost none of them can point you to a date that it occurred, or even an era, or even a decade when it occurred. I've met one guy that could, or that tried to. I disagree with his analysis, but his analysis was that it happened in 1932 when the height of the Depression, or the beginning of the Depression, African-American voters abandoned the GOP because they didn't see the GOP as caring about them, while they saw Franklin D. Roosevelt as caring about them. And so his position was that that's when it happened. So that said, we're going to talk about that. But that said, I'm going to say some things, particularly in this episode, that are not putting the Democrat Party in the best of light. And I recognize that in our environment today, some of you may see that as criticizing the Democrat Party. Some of you may see that as, see, those Democrats were evil, blah, blah, blah. You can take it that way if you want to, or you can wait. Because believe me, the main point of all of this is that neither party is going to come out of this looking very good. Neither party is true to its official roots. Neither party really did anything to stop any of this from happening. Both parties used it to their political advantage, and both parties today are still doing that. And that's, whether you believe they switched places or not, is irrelevant. They're still doing the same things. And so, as I give you some of these definitions, keep that in mind. Don't go out there posting, oh, Dave said that the Democrats were evil, blah, blah. Because we're talking about the 1870s here, and specifically 1876. We're not talking about today. And as I said, as we move further on here, neither party's going to come out of this looking good. The Bourbon Democrats, as they were known, were a group of Democrats. They never called themselves the Bourbon Democrats. That was a slanderous term that was used about them, but it has stuck throughout history. They were, listen to this, if I didn't say to you Democrat, if I just said the Bourbons, they promoted a form of laissez-faire capitalism, opposition to the high tariff protectionism that the Republicans were then advancing, as well as fiscal discipline. They wanted to restrain spending. They were interested in business interests, generally supporting the goals of banking and railroads, big business, but opposed to subsidies for them. And that's very libertarian, right? And they were unwilling to protect them from competition. Well, that's very conservative, eh? They opposed American imperialism and overseas expansion. They were very much for the gold standard, bimetallism, and promoted what they called hard and sound money. And we will get into some of that today. This is not an economics podcast by any stretch of the imagination, but we'll talk about a little bit of that. They were very strong supporters of states' rights, reform movements such as the civil service reform, which we don't talk about today, but believe me, in the 1870s, really through the early 1900s, that was a huge deal. And they were the opponents of corrupt city bosses. This also something we don't talk about today, but in that era, city bosses were seen as a bad thing. And the Bourbons were heavily involved in the fight against them. They were anti-corruption, and that theme actually earned them a lot of Republican votes in the later elections, specifically in 1884. The Republicans were fed up with some of the corruptive issues, and they went with the Democrats, the Bourbon Democrats, on the anti-corruption issue. Now, there's really only one thing you really need to understand about the Bourbon Democrats. Strong supporters of states' rights. This is a very soft way of saying what they were, which was they were white supremacists. States' rights in that era meant undoing much of what Reconstruction had done in the sense of giving the freedmen, the former slaves, rights to own property, rights, any of the rights that they had won, and making sure that they did not gain control over the governments of the southern states. It's a little disturbing. I know Godwin's law and all that, but much of the language that the Bourbon Democrats use in their strong support of states' rights in the 1870s, and particularly in 1875 and 1876, much of the language that they use is very eerily similar to language that will be used 60 years later in Europe. It is almost verbatim in some cases, just different targets. If we don't take action to defend our race, our power, our right to live the way we choose to, if we don't destroy those that oppose it, then we will be subsumed by them. The Bourbon Democrats have a group known as the Redeemers. Now, the Redeemers are the southern wing of the Bourbon Democrats. You need to understand the Bourbon Democrats are nationwide. But the Redeemers are the southern wing of that. They are dedicated, hardcore dedicated to white supremacy, and they want to redeem the southern states from Republican power. And to that end, there is no length to which these Redeemers will not go to regain political power in the former Confederate states. They have two paramilitary groups that are affiliated with them, the White League, which is in Louisiana, and the Red Shirts, which are in Mississippi, and as we talked about last week, in South Carolina. And these two groups are openly affiliated with the Redeemers, to the point where they literally will march down the streets wearing their shirts, their red shirts that you can still see on display in some museums in some places. They will carry their arms. They make it clear in political campaigns. They make it clear that they are supported by or supporting the red shirts or the White League. And it's eerily reminiscent of 60 years later when you have the SA roaming through the streets, beating up anybody that disagrees with Adolf Hitler. In the same vein, these Red Shirts and this White League are doing the same thing. They also have rifle clubs, which are a little more secret. It's intriguing to understand this, because if you understand the history of this, the KKK is almost non-existent at this point. It had been formed earlier, but Ulysses Grant had really suppressed it. It is almost non-existent. It is a relic of a bygone era. Nobody really thinks about it. Nobody really cares about it. It will make its comeback, obviously, later on, but right now, it's just forgotten. And more importantly, the KKK is a secretive organization. You don't tell people that you belong to the KKK. Whereas the Red Shirts and the White League, if you're a member of this, they are as open as they can possibly be. They have no fear whatsoever. And indeed, as we saw last week in South Carolina, in Hamburg, they literally will intimidate a judge into allowing them to murder 8 people. And to this day, as I said last week, no one has ever been held accountable for that, ever. And that's problematic to me. Now, when we start our story for this week, we have to go to Chicago, Illinois. I know, it's a strange place to start. And the year is 1983. Now, the United States Football League was one of those things that only some people really liked. I happened to be one of them in those days. I was very excited about the USFL. My team was the Denver Gold and later the Oklahoma Outlaws. It was interesting, it was exciting, and it was in the spring. And so essentially, when combined with the NFL and college, you had year-round football. It was wonderful. And the games were not well attended, but at least they were televised. And everybody assumed, and I know what happens when you assume, but everybody assumed that at some point, the USFL and the NFL would merge and we would have more football teams and it would be great. That was always the assumption. But for the time being, 1983, there were 2 teams that were particularly intriguing. The Chicago Blitz were a team that was not wanted. The guy that owned it was from Phoenix, Arizona. He hated Chicago, didn't want to be in Chicago. He wanted a team in Phoenix. But he had been unable to get a team in Phoenix, and the people who had the team in Phoenix just didn't really care. The team down in Arizona, known as the Wranglers, was bad. I mean, they were really bad. Even back in those days, they were kind of a joke. Whereas the Blitz, the owner, although he didn't want to be there and didn't like it there and didn't care for it there, he at least cared about his team, and he put together what is generally referred to as the third or fourth best team in the United States Football League in that era. Vince Evans was their quarterback. George Allen was their coach for a while. They were actually trying to win, and whereas the Wranglers were not. But at the end of the '83 season, the first season, the Wranglers were really just on the edge of bankruptcy and collapse and everything else. And the owners were just trying to sell and everything else. And the guy in Chicago saw an opportunity here. And so he swung a deal on September 20th, 1983. It's an important date in history. He swung a deal to essentially buy the Wranglers, sell the Blitz, but what made it unique was the two teams just essentially entirely and completely switched places. With the exception of one player, the entire Blitz team, coaches, equipment people, copy machines, everything went to Phoenix, and everything that was in Phoenix went to Chicago. And the next year, oddly enough, the Wranglers were the third or fourth best team in the league, whereas the Bourbon Democrat, whereas, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there for just a second. Whereas the Blitz became the laughingstock and literally folded 4 games before the end of the season. Now, this is this idea here that I'm talking about complete switching of things. This idea that two entities can completely switch their identities, their external identities, but their internal identities really didn't change that much, did it? It really didn't matter all that much. If you think about it, I mean, the team that was hitherto known as the Blitz still continued to play well, whereas the team that had been known as the Wranglers literally sucked in Arizona, and they still sucked in Chicago. They sucked so bad that they folded. The new team came in. They kept the same name and everything, but they were known as the New Blitz, and they never actually played a game because the league ended up folding before they could do it. The external identities had shifted, but the internal identities had stayed the same. It's this idea of being able to swap things that I want to drive home to you as you get it, particularly when we talk about this concept that the parties have switched. The Republicans and Democrats have switched. And the Republicans of today are the Democrats of 1876. And the Republicans of that day are now the Democrats of today. That they have completely shifted. Only the idea here now is that rather than their external identities, they've switched internal identities. Right? And if you look at that definition of the Bourbon Democrats, you could say, well, those Bourbon Democrats sound an awful lot like conservative Republicans today, don't they? At least what they say they are. Whether they really are or not really doesn't matter. And so you end up asking that question, did they switch? Did it ever really happen? When did it happen? If it did, if it happened, how did it happen? What and you got to be careful when you get into this, because things aren't always what they seem. And that's part of the problem with it. For example, this particular paper from September 20th, 1963. It's an important date, September 20th, for a lot of reasons. This is actually the day after September 20th, but you get the idea. If you were to just pick up this paper in Oklahoma City, which is where I was on that day, you would see that big headline there, Soviets renew bitter dispute with Peking over test ban. That was a big deal about Bowman and China accused of treachery to the party line. And Kennedy had just made his moonshot offer, and everybody was like blown away. We choose to go to the moon. And everybody was like, whoa. Right in the middle, the 56th State Fair was getting ready to open too. Right in the middle of that, GOP lashes tax cut plan as dangerous. Did you hear that? GOP, Republicans, lashes tax cut plan as dangerous. When you delve into that a little bit, spokesman urges spending cuts, including in the bill. the headline would give you the idea that the GOP was opposing the tax cuts of John Kennedy in 1963, which they were, but not quite as not quite as vehemently as you might think they were. They were actually opposed to not having spending cuts. So even though it appears that they've changed their position, they really haven't. You kind of see what I'm driving at here? Just because something seems like it's changed its opinion doesn't necessarily mean that it has. Now, what does this have to do with anything? If we go back to what we're talking about today, we're talking about these Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Okay? You need to keep in mind that in the 1860s into 1870, when these amendments were ratified, in one case, force ratified, the Democrat Party, particularly the Bourbon Democrats, vehemently opposed these amendments. Even in the North, the Democrats opposed these amendments. Now, the difference was politically, the Democrat Party was essentially neutered during the 1860s, during the Civil War and post-Civil War, and radical Republicans, as they were known back then, or black Republicans, as they were known somewhat derisively, were easily in charge. They had veto-proof majorities. They didn't have to worry about filibusters. They didn't have anything to do with that. But as these amendments were opposed, and as laws, even after they were passed, as laws began to grind in, okay, you ban slavery, but you can't make us not treat them equally. Well, 14th Amendment, no, they're citizens. You have to treat them as citizens. And that, by the way, undoing the Dred Scott decision specifically. And you have to give them equal protection of the law. Well, okay, but that doesn't mean we have to let them vote. Well, yeah, you do. But all of this took time. Civil War ends in April, May of 1865, depending on which side which theater you're looking at. And you need to understand that people were being worn down by this. Not only had they had a vicious war, 300,000 plus Union troops had died in that war. Probably 1 million more wounded, including, by the way, my great-grandfather, who would end up dying probably because of his wounds at the very early age of 53. There was no family in the Union that had been untouched by this, and if you were to include the Southern armies in this, you would be appalled at the cost of that war. Not just financially, not just the fact that the government had instituted its first income tax to fund the war, not because of all of those things and the destruction and all of those things, but just the lives lost. That had worn on the public greatly. And the joy of victory can only carry you so far. My own experience in 1991 during the first Gulf War and the end of the Cold War. Two wars ending almost simultaneously, the Cold War and the first Gulf War, both of which I was involved with peripherally in one and directly in the other. The parades, everything down Virginia Beach Boulevard into Mount Rushmore and all Trashmore, so not Rushmore, Mount Trashmore. All of those things were exciting and fun, and everybody was on hand with their yellow ribbons and saying thank you and blah, blah, blah. And then it just kind of went, because the economy went, and you ended up with James Carville saying it's the economy, stupid. And Bill Clinton wins the election literally the next year. It was weird the way this giant bubble of happiness, this giant accomplishment, sort of just the air just went out of it. It didn't pop. It just went. And the same thing is happening in the country in the early 1870s. Reconstruction in the South is wearing down the nation. It's expensive. It's unpopular. It is creating a lot of resentment in the South. It's creating a lot of political battles. And on top of all this, you have Ulysses Grant as president, who is a great man. You know, there's a lot of this argument about who should be next on Mount Rushmore. Number one, nobody should be next on Mount Rushmore, but if anybody was, U.S. Grant is certainly a guy that deserves some consideration there. But his presidency is a disaster. His presidency is, he tries to run his presidency like he ran the army. By the end of the war, he was the general of the army, only the third one we'd ever had, behind Winfield Scott and George Washington. The difference was in the army, if a general didn't perform, you just get rid of him and you plug in the next guy. And eventually you have a bunch of generals that know what they're doing, and he just sort of guides it like a director, and off it goes. But in a political environment, that doesn't work. You fire a cabinet secretary for doing something untold, and he goes to the newspapers and starts yapping running his gums. Boy, do we see that anymore, huh? And unfortunately, Grant surrounded himself with men who were not up to the task. And there were a great number of scandals in his administration that were probably not his fault, other than the buck stops here. And because of this, there was a lot of... There was just the ideas of things were just not, there was no post-war boom like there should have been. There were people were getting tired and they were getting frustrated. And although the nation was growing and expanding, there was still some problems. By this point, the blue states that you see there are what you would call union states. They're either they never left the union or they have been readmitted, like Texas, Arkansas, Georgia, Virginia, Tennessee, although Tennessee never actually was allowed to leave the union. They voted to, but they were occupied. North Carolina, Alabama. Colorado had been added on August 1st, 1876. And so those are your union states. But there are three states you will see there, if you're watching the video, in bright red. These three states, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, are the heart and soul of the Redeemer movement. They are the heart and soul of where the Bourbon Democrats are seeking to really play their game. They're really seeking to win these elections. They already got it successfully done in Mississippi. They have wrested control of Mississippi from the Republicans, even though Mississippi had already been readmitted. They have chased out all of the African Americans who became senators and state legislators there, the governor. They have reestablished firm Bourbon Democrat control of Mississippi. And they did it using, as we talked about last week, the Mississippi Plan, which is this idea that they'll use violent threats, open intimidation, persuade 10 to 15% of scallywags, what they called scallywags in South Carolina, or Mississippi, to vote Democrat. That's Republicans, white Republicans. And they will use rifle clubs and red shirts and white leagues to intimidate the freedmen, to get them to not vote at all. The plan worked in Mississippi. As we talked about last week, it was exported to South Carolina. And the violence here is nationwide. I mean, there are incidents everywhere, but primarily in those three states, particularly South Carolina, where hundreds end up dying, particularly hundreds of freedmen, Black Americans, end up dying because of this effort to wrest control from the Republicans. We talked last week about Hamburg, South Carolina, where 8 will die. We have in Ellenton, South Carolina, in September, another 100 will die. In a little town called Cainhoy, South Carolina, at least that we know of, 3 died. There are some estimates that it's a great deal more. And this unrest throughout all the nation. So you have this political unrest. The Democrat Party has been gaining seats in Washington. And in fact, they took control of the House in the previous election. They are, in the 1874 elections, they have control of the House. They are gaining in authority and power. And while the Redeemers are focused on the South, the Bourbon Democrats as a whole are focused on retaking the White House, retaking these things. And boy, is it going to be a mess. When they go to their conventions that summer, the Democrat Party, there's no doubt who their candidate will be. Not only is he a Democrat governor, he's a Democrat governor of a union state, a Yankee state, New York. He is vehemently anti-slavery, which is a big point in this era. Much like today, where people are going back in people's history, they were still going back to pre-war history in that era. And Tilden had been anti-slavery. He had supported the Union. He did not like Abraham Lincoln, and in fact, worked diligently for George Brenton McClellan's campaign in 1864. But he did support the Union, and supporting McClellan was seen as a good way of doing that. But he was vehemently anti-corruption. He fought corruption in New York City and New York State. And again, in that era, that was a huge deal. We don't see it that way today. We just don't for some reason. And politicians who do see it that way don't seem to last long. They certainly don't get nominated to major political party positions. Tilden did something interesting in the election of 1876. He ran the first nationwide newspaper campaign. As I said, I've been looking at newspapers all across the country for this, and it's intriguing to see it's a different kind of advertising, but you can tell it's advertising in virtually every paper in the country. And I don't know who coordinated that. I need to do a little more research on that one, but it's intriguing to see this first nationwide newspaper campaign. The opponents, the Republicans, will try it. It's not quite as successful, but they will get there. He is also, as we talked about, a hard money Democrat. Now, again, this is not an economics podcast, but what you need to know is hard money people favor the gold standard and specie. That is what they are about. Now, very briefly, there are two kinds of financial systems here in the country. You have the hard currency, the specie system, which is the gold standard, and you have the fiat system, which is what we use today. Both systems, regardless of how you feel about the Fed or anything like that, both systems have their advantages and both have their disadvantages. Obviously, the hard money system has an advantage when it comes to spending and that sort of thing and deficits, whereas the fiat system has the ability to absorb shocks much easier and much better, which was part of the problem. Some of the worst that we're used to hearing about the worst depression since the 1930s. 2008 was bad, but really many people will tell you that the depressions and the recessions in the 1820s and 1830s were functionally far worse because the hard money system can't really absorb that. As they go to the conventions, the Republican candidate appears to be Representative James G. Blaine of Maine. Now, Blaine is well known to the country. He is a vehement hard Republican, radical Republican. He's the former Speaker of the House who just lost his speakership in the previous election because of the change from Republicans to Democrats. But Blaine is, how do I say this politely? He is a typical sleazy politician using his office to make himself rich, and he has been for years. He was accused in previous elections of some corruption, and he managed to basically slip by it. Nobody's really sure how, but he did. But later on, one of his own accounting clerks will write a letter to the newspaper guy by the Mulligan, and these letters will basically say, yeah, he did it, and here's the proof. And the Republicans at the convention are looking at this going, crap, we got an anti-corruption Democrat running, and our favorite candidate is just full of corruption. How can we nominate this guy? And over the series of numerous votes at the convention, back when they actually meant something, they settle on a guy by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes. He's the governor of Ohio. So he is likewise a governor. He, too, anti-slavery. Not only is he anti-slavery, but he is a former Union general. Not only just a former Union general, he is a wounded veteran of the Great War who fought for the Union. And by all accounts, even though he is what you would call a political general, of which there were many in the Civil War, he actually comes across as very competent as a soldier. In fact, when he was wounded, he was a major at South Mountain. He has been anti-corruption. He's been fighting corruption in Ohio, much like Tilden was in New York. He had been a congressman in 1864. While he was a general in the war, he was nominated for Congress from Ohio. Told him, I'm not going to run, but here's a letter. Here's a letter to the newspaper saying this is why you should vote for me. And then he said, and even if I do win, I'm not leaving the battlefield to go sit in Congress. When the war's over, then I'll go, but not until we've gotten the job done. And that's what happened. He got elected, but he stayed in the field until the war was over, and then he went to Washington. He, like Tilden, is also a hard money Republican, which makes it an intriguing election because the second Tuesday in November of 1876 is going to be a watershed moment in U.S. history. I don't think anybody realizes it at that moment. They look at this much as we look at things today, and yet they don't see what they should have seen as very obvious. Tilden and Hayes are virtually identical. Okay, one's a lifelong Democrat, one's a lifelong Republican, but their views on virtually everything, education, finance, international relationships, and indeed Reconstruction, are virtually lockstep with one another. There is so little difference really between these two that it's hard to believe that I don't know how you would make up your mind if you were a thinking voter in all of this. But the nation itself is restless, beyond belief restless. The nation itself is tearing itself apart. The Bourbon Democrats, led by the Redeemers in the South, are determined to eliminate Republican rule because they believe, remember, though the 14th Amendment has passed, there is no such thing yet as incorporation. So your state constitutions and your state laws, while the federal government cannot interfere with some of your rights, keep and bear arms, trial by juries, any of those things, searches and seizures. While the federal government can't, the states still can. And these states, led by the Southern Bourbon Democrat Redeemers, are salivating at the idea that if they regain power, they can start passing laws that will ultimately become known as Jim Crow laws. And they will essentially reinstitute the same system prior to the war, the antebellum system. They just don't actually own anybody. They just own them, if you get my meaning there. They can't, sell them. But for all practical purposes, they're going to control everything in the same exact way that they were. But they are terrified, and they are using every vestige of violence and intimidation that they can to stop this from happening. They use the same argument, literally, that the Nazis will use later on, that if they don't destroy the black man, if they don't destroy the freedman in the South, that somehow or another they will rise up and rule over them. And that will be bad. Harper's Weekly notices it. And after some of the massacres, Hamburg, Ellington, they actually run this cartoon in 1876. In self-defense, Southern chivalry says, if I hadn't killed you, you would have grown up to rule me. You can't have that. Folks, this reminds me so much of the episode we did on Henry Gale. I know it's hard to see this stuff. I know it's hard to think about this stuff. I know it's hard to consider that. But this is what America was in 1876. And leading into that second Tuesday in November of 1876, and this is a much different election than we have today. Nobody is going to know that day who won. It will be weeks. If everything goes right, it will be weeks before anybody has any results from the election. In fact, I was reading what used to be known as the Sacramento Daily Bee last week, and they were talking about the groups, the Democrat and Republican groups, meeting in the bars each night as the election goes forward, as more results come in, and betting each other as to who's going to win and by how much. It's weird. Both parties believe that if they gain the power, their opponents will be subdued. And that's what's important. It's not our positions, because as you can see, their positions are virtually identical. Their positions are so minor league difference that there is almost no reason to even consider those kinds of things. I have to say that myself, if I had been there, I would have voted for Hayes. Why? Because ultimately I value military service. And I'm not a George Brenton McClellan guy. I know what he did, and I know his value to the Union cause, and I understand all that, but Tilden's work for him would kind of, other than that, it's a coin toss, even for me. The belief, like the USFL believed, is if we can change places with the other guy, it'll make things better. Everybody will be happier. Everything will work better. The Union will get their way. They'll be able to do what they want to do, and the South will be able to go its own way and do what it wants to do, which is essentially return to the same conditions they had before. Just, technically we can't own you, but we can still run your life, control everything you do, tell you where to live, tell you what to eat, tell you when to sleep, when to vote. Well, you can't vote, what to wear, what you can have, what you can't have. That's what they want. And both sides believe that their way will make it better. The Union is tired of Reconstruction. They're tired of having to deal with these recalcitrant children down in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. They're tired of it. They're tired of having to spank them because they're stupid. Why can't you be like Georgia and Mississippi and Virginia and accept these things and just move on? It's costing us money. We're tired of our boys having to live down there when they should be home farming. That's why we're having more and more African Americans as troopers down there. Put the burden on them. Make them have, as Frederick Douglass said, we got to stand on our own. We can't wait for everybody else to hold us up. We do that, what's going to happen? The danger here, and there are Republicans who say this. It's a very interesting article. I think it's in the Tribune, the Chicago Tribune, leading into the election, of the fact that there is a belief that if the Democrats win, it's going to destroy the country because they are going to undo everything. They are going to undo the 14th, 15th, and 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Not the 16th, because that won't pass for another 50 years. But the idea is the other side is so evil that they're going to destroy everything. You understand me? The other side, whichever side you're on, is so evil that they are going to destroy everything. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Is it just me? Or is it everybody? Does everybody see what I'm talking about here? We've come to believe so narrow-mindedly in 1876 that even when we analyze these candidates 144 years later, and we can see that they are virtually identical in just about everywhere. Now, there's some differences, and I get that, but on the major issues, there is so little difference between them that it's really not going to matter. Not that much. But we got to demonize, we got to terrorize, we got to kill people because we're afraid that if the other side gets or maintains power, everything will be destroyed. If we look around today and we're saying exactly the same things, I think it's going to get better. But in 1876, on the second Monday night, 1876, as everybody went to bed preparing to get up the next morning, they think it's going to get better. But no matter what happens, they're about to make it a lot worse.